Hello and welcome to The Price of Music, the show that looks at the money behind the music industry with me, Steve Lamack, and Music Ally's Head of Insight, Stuart Dredge. This week, and this is partly in response to some listeners who we've spoken to who've been asking about various facets of music management, not least what does it entail and how much does it pay. So this week we're chatting to Annabella Coldrick, who is Chief Executive of the Music Managers Forum. This is the organisation which represents the people, those managers whose task it is to help and guide their artists through their careers, which apparently turns out not as easy as you might think, and also in some cases not necessarily incredibly well paid either. To this end, the MMF has just issued a new guide which suggests that old school manager gets 20% of everything model might not be the way forward for managers in the future, especially when new acts are starting out, because, as we know, 20% of nothing is nothing. So what's the alternative, and what can managers do to make a living in these cash-strapped times? Here's Annabella. Annabella, welcome to The Price of Music.
Thank you very much for having me. Great to speak to you both.
Now, listen, before we get into the cut and thrust of music management, we always like to give our listeners just a bit of context. So can you give us a very brief sort of history and overview of the MMF and what role it actually has?
Absolutely. So whilst I've been at the MMF for 9 years, the MMF was actually founded in 1992 at a conference in Manchester called In the City that you might both remember.
Yeah.
I must admit, I never got the chance to go, but the story I'm told, the apocryphal story, is that there were about 300 managers in the City conference, and the BPI chair, Maurice Oberstein, spoke about the introduction of a new incoming format, which I don't think ever took off. It was called the digital compact cassette. Remember that in 1992? But anyway, apparently it was going to be the big new thing, and it was going to require lots of investment from the record labels, and the artists should also help bear the cost of its implementation by a reduction in royalty rates to help cover the cost of this. So you can just imagine the reaction of the managers. They were all like, not again, we're furious. And apparently they stormed across the road to a pub, and out of that spirit of protest, so I'm told, the MMF first came together. So very much as a kind of advocacy organisation initially. But very quickly, I think the managers realised there was a role to support not just the kind of fury and advocacy and let's try and change the industry, but also kind of education, professional standards and development for managers at all stages of their career. Because it's quite a strange profession in a way. People fall into it from all kinds of backgrounds. I mean, even when I talk to some of our sort of long established members, a lot of them just ended up helping out a friend or a band at uni and sort of learnt the ropes along the way. So we've very much seen our role as kind of helping people, understand the industry they're working in, understand how to set up businesses with their clients. We have a code of practice of standards that managers should adhere to. So, being transparent, putting the interests of your client first, obviously not double dipping, being very clear on accounting, all kinds of different elements. But we kind of now straddle those roles. So we do education. We help our members stay in touch with innovation. So how the industry is always changing, no matter how long you've been doing it. And then we still get very involved in the advocacy. So we campaign on issues like secondary ticketing. We help set up the fanfare campaign. I'm one of the founders of the Council of Music Makers that campaigns for sort of an amnesty on digital royalty rates to address the unfairnesses in that area. So, I mean, you can imagine whenever you get a bunch of managers together, that's one of the issues that comes up is like, how do we make the industry a bit better? So that's where we're a collective voice.
I mean, the other thing, in very simplistic terms as well, it must be nice to have somewhere to turn to, because management, I think, can be quite a lonely experience, probably, can't it, for some people, because you're sat in an office with all the responsibility on your shoulders, and where do you turn? It's all down to you.
I think you're absolutely right, and there's often, I think maybe less so nowadays, but there certainly was a fear that by showing you didn't know something, it was a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength. And I think certainly the best managers I've met are those who are like, actually, I don't know this. Does anyone understand anything about music and gaming? Has anyone, I mean, I'm on all these WhatsApp chats because we have these accelerator managers, like a cohort of 20 each year, and they're all still asking each other questions. Someone was like, oh, my artist has been offered to do something with Storm Model Agency. Has anyone ever dealt with the modelling world? Has anyone ever dealt with this area? Oh, I'm touring in Australia for the first time. Does anyone know anyone out there? And you're right. I think it's people get a real sense of relief when they come in and find there is a community that they can trust, rather than just feeling like, oh God, it's me versus the world. And I do still meet people like that. They are a bit like, it's me and the band and we're against everything and we're not part of the industry. But there is a bit of the, God, it's cliched, isn't it? But the stronger together, better together stuff. I'm thinking back to various referendum campaigns, in it. But yeah, people joining up and kind of, sharing the pain as well. And sometimes, to be honest, Stuart and Steve, that can be about like the difficulties they're having with their clients and how challenging that can be, as well as the difficulties they're having with the rest of the industry.
I've been in a couple of pub conversations with a few managers when they start really dishing the kind of like, this is what happened, and they're amazing. I mean, the things that they have to deal with and the things that they kind of have to put up with is going to be amazing, can't it? I think what they have to.
Well, that's the thing. It can be incredibly exciting, but there are so few boundaries. And we've done a load of reports on things like managers' mental health. And we're like, yes, you should sit down, respect yourself as a professional that's working with your clients. But so often they all started off as mates. They're often around the same age. Not always, of course. There are very different circumstances. But then when you've started out that way, starting to kind of put boundaries in and go, do you know what? It's not okay to, what was the story I heard? Someone getting a phone call at 2 a.m. asking, the artist was in Miami and they wanted the manager to book them a taxi. And when the manager said, well, why don't you call the front desk? They said, oh, well, the other band has someone to do that for them and I don't, so I want you to do it for me.
Wow.
There are silly things, and sometimes you get it. It's because the artist is insecure as well. So the person they want to speak to is the person they trust the most. But that can lead to so many blurring of boundaries, which, can be a sign of strength, but also can lead to really big kind of professional and mental health challenges because never any time to switch off.
I mean, as kind of context for what we're going to talk about today, which is the new report you have, we wanted to kind of ask about the bigger picture, I suppose, over the last decade, which I guess chimes pretty clearly with when you started at the MF, and how, I guess, the changing shape of the music industry has changed the job of managers. Because from the outside, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like they wear a lot more hats nowadays. Like some of the stuff that used to be done by other people, be that labels or bookers or promoters, as a manager now, especially of an up-and-coming act, maybe you're doing a lot more of the stuff. But is that fair that the role of a manager has kind of changed and expanded?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think initially, the barriers to entry, I know you guys talk about this on your podcast all the time, like it's much easier to release music than it ever was. I used to manage bands very, very badly back at Nottingham University in the 90s. And other than printing up a few CDs at home, you couldn't put out releases yourself. You needed a label, you needed the investment because it was just too difficult to do. Now anyone can put music out. That means inevitably early days artists and their managers are like working on everything collectively together and taking on every single role where they might not have been able to in the past. And then it's quite difficult to have a conversation and go, you know how I was doing all the release management, all the campaign management, all the digital marketing. Actually, now we need to pay someone else to do all those things because I can't afford to do it. Or if you want me to do it, maybe I need to earn differently for the additional time I'm putting in, rather than just coordinating lots of other professionals who are bringing those skills. So I think there's a starting from scratch, and certainly it taking, possibly 2 to 3 years now, maybe even longer, for an artist to get to a stage where they're actually making any money so they can earn a living, never mind their manager earn a living. But I also hear that at the other end of the spectrum too. You've covered this as well. A lot of the big companies, the major labels, have been laying off staff. And so I've been hearing of managers, established management companies with big artists, the ones that you'd all have heard of, who are like, actually, there's no one to handle our marketing budgets anymore. So we've got a big release out, we're going to the label and they're saying, sorry, the marketing guy's gone. And you're like, well, the release is still happening. Oh, well, we'll give you the money to spend on the marketing. And then again, that's another thing. The manager's then having to get a digital agency and manage that. And you're like, well, hang on a minute. That was someone's salary. in a label. And now that's just something I've ended up picking up as well. So that's what I mean. It's not just at the early stage, it's also at the much, and that's also why management companies end up having a lot more. There are some of the bigger management companies have a lot more of those kind of central resources in house. So, digital marketing, and Red Light famously has plugging as well. And I mean, I think that's been happening over several years, but yeah, certainly the last 10 years, more and more of it's sort of come in house. But it's the skills as well. It's the time and the skills that some of our members really, really struggle with, particularly as it takes so long to make any cash.
It's really interesting, isn't it? It's a kind of passing of the buck from certain people, and the buck seems to now stop with managers who are just expected to have more knowledge and more hours in the day. Which I guess, is this what prompted this? Because we should talk about your new management deals guide. Is all this what led you to present us with, new options for how managers are being paid?
Yeah, I think nearly every conversation I had with the manager this year was along some of these lines. Was like, oh, I've gone back to being the tour manager, or I've been doing the booking, or I'm effectively running a label, but I'm trying to do it on 20% commission, and there isn't enough to do it. And every conversation was around that. Or indeed, actually, some were really positive. You guys will know Kwame Quatten, who was the vice chair of the MMF until very recently, and he manages Hack Baker and Blue Lab Beats and a load of artists. And he's created something he calls the fan deal, because Kwame loves an acronym, which is essentially a joint venture where they brought in the comms and the PR and the plugging and the management and the artist all into one company, where everyone effectively owns shares in the company, and they're all vested in that project around a release or an album. And so, yeah, they're all incentivized for that to do well, rather than being like, oh, actually, we've got to pay everyone individually up front and then wait for a really long time until we've built it enough to earn any return. So I guess, yeah, Steve, sorry, back to your point. Yeah, it was a combination of people saying it's not working. And every time I try and have a conversation about changing it, I'm told, no, you've got to go back to the standard, and the standard's all you can do. So that conversation, and then a load of other people are like, no, we are doing it differently. We've been doing it differently for a while, but we just don't shout about it enough. We're not talking about it. And Vicky Dowdall, who's managed Nina Nesbitt for years, they're brilliant, and they founded a label together, co-founded a label. Vicky's gone off and got investment because Nina was saying, well, actually, we're doing nearly all of it in-house anyway. We're doing all the because nearly all the promotion, a lot of it is now around social media, so that comes back to the artist and manager. So they were like, well, actually, we might as well just own our own label together. So that's what they're doing. So yeah, the purpose of the guide was to try and kind of lay it all out, and not say, because a few people said to me, oh, we need one new model, it needs to be 30% commission. I'm like, well, that, if you're not making any money for 3 years, whether it's 20% or 30%, might not make that much of a difference. And if you can never get paid your sunset clause because the relationship's broken down, which happens in some cases, that doesn't help either. So are there other ways that things can... So yeah, the whole point is that it kind of sets out a load of different options, and it depends what the business looks like, because artist businesses are really different, as you know, different genres. Some genres make loads of money from live, particularly if you're in the electronic music space where your costs are relatively low. Others lose money on live for years and years and years until you get to kind of 3,000 to 5,000 capacity. And even then, if you keep ramping up show production costs because you want it to have lasers. I was talking to a member the other day who did the coolest show at Coco with loads and loads of lasers. And I said, it sold out. And I was like, that sounds awesome. Did you make any money? Oh, no, we lost money. We spent all the money on lasers. I'm like, I wish I'd gone, actually. It sounded amazing. But yeah. So yeah, it's try and open up the options and the conversations, really.
So it's basically just putting in front of people the idea that the old manager gets 20% of everything the artist gets model is not necessarily right for everyone in this day and age.
Yeah, and I think it can still work in some circumstances where the manager is very much deal maker and project manager of lots of other people. But it's like, if we're taking loads more in-house, if we're not, I have some stats about how many of our members have basically invested their own money. I think 74% of our members in a survey said they'd invested their own money into clients' careers. 35% used personal savings. 40% got no outside investments. You putting time, and time is money, let's face it. You're spending several years working, and a lot of our members have other jobs as well. I think 26% of people who responded to our survey working full-time or part-time. 25% are earning really well, but an awful lot are earning about £10,000 from music management. So again, it's all kind of part of a really long play. A lot of them work elsewhere in the music industry or do other jobs. And it's like, if I'm going to invest all this time and effort, maybe I need to have some more skin in the game rather than, I work for many years and then the moment it takes off, an American management company comes in and goes, if you want to be really famous, you need to come and sign with us. And then it's like, 5 years. And finally, we were starting to see some returns. And next thing you know, you're out the door. So it's some kind of security, and it won't work for everyone. But the idea was to help people at least have that. And I do know of 2 or 3 members since we put it out there who've kind of then gone and had that conversation with their artists and the artist lawyers and gone, look, when you tell us it's not possible to do anything other than 20%, this shows it is possible. There's not one thing in our guide that we've published that isn't being done by one or more of our members.
You talked about the fan deal, joint ventures. What are the other interesting models that you've seen or that you've seen come through in the guide? Because it feels like you say, there's so many different ones and they're all customized to what that one is doing. What have been the ones that have kind of jumped out at you as particularly interesting on you?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many. Obviously, sometimes there are co-management agreements, and the lawyers will say, well, it still should be 20% because that's what the manager gets. But if you've got 2 people with different skill sets, both bringing that to the artist, then having a conversation about how co-management works, not only how do the managers work together, but how are they both incentivized to put in all that extra time. So co-management agreements, again, not new, but enabling people to go, well, actually, we are bringing more skills and more brains than one person, so maybe there should be some added. And I think that's easier, to be honest, when it's a solo artist or a duo. I think it becomes quite difficult if you've got like 5 people in the band and 2 co-managers. The amount of money that's being spread out between a lot of people, even if arguably the managers could say, well, we're in some cases doing a lot more work than one of the many band members who comes out when they're on tour and in the recording studio, but the rest of the time isn't, doing 8 hours a day or a lot more. So it's there's loads of different deals. Like I said, the fan deal is quite an interesting one. Obviously, some managers run their own labels and do development deals. I've spoken to a few who've done that, where they invest money and initially license the copyrights. Other ones where the manager and artist together own the copyrights, or when actually the artist owns the copyrights outright, but the manager takes a revenue stream. So sort of reverse like you'd be on a major label. So, the artist is keeping 80% of the money, but of the 20%, actually the manager has a longer term revenue, not just a commission. So if then, say, you've worked on the first album and you spent many years helping develop the live show and not earning, and then the artist chooses to go and sign to a major and maybe go with a big international management company, you would still have a revenue stream in those original copyrights, which a lot of the time managers don't, if you see what I mean. So when I get members who are like, well, everyone else is earning a pension from this. The producer who worked in the studio, who did a brilliant job, but was there for, maybe a couple of months, if it was quite a longer recording thing, the songwriters rightly are all still earning. The artists obviously are earning. The label is still earning. The publisher's still earning. And yet the manager who worked on that project from day one and who really vested in a traditional model can get nothing once they're beyond their sunset clause. And even in that case, sometimes, like I said, it's quite hard to enforce. Whereas, if you have some participation in the long-term recordings, and some artists will say that, well, there should be longer term. Some managers will say, well, if we spent years building the live show as well, there should be some ongoing participation when they're performing. Because I've heard of things where you work for a long time to get a live show to the point where it's all about to go, and then trying to earn, if you then are let go and they move to a new management company for whatever reason, then actually you have invested in that development, so you should see some payback from that.
Oh, absolutely. You should explain for listeners who don't know what it is, what the sunset clause is, which is in some management contracts.
So yeah, I mean, this normally is to acknowledge the fact that you've worked for a certain amount of time on an artist, where you'll then see it scaling down over 5 to 10 years. So your commission doesn't, the 20% commission on the projects you've worked on doesn't stop immediately. Instead, it reduces. And I'm told that's something that didn't necessarily used to occur. And it only relates to the projects you've worked on. So it would only relate to the albums you've worked on. But it can mean after 5 years or after 10 years, you're earning nothing on those albums that you worked on. Whereas, like I said, everyone else is. That's why it's called a sunset, because it goes down with the sun.
Right.
But it can be quite hard. And if a relationship really breaks down and the manager needs to invoice for the money that they're owed on those albums or those projects they worked on, if you're not getting accounted to, and, sometimes relationships end, but they don't end badly. So there's a lot of, you hear of things where it's like, okay, I've loved working with you for 10 years. I just feel it's time to work with someone else, but don't worry, I'm still going to pay you what you're due. Then it's fine. You'll get the accounting from the artist, what they've earned. You go, well, I worked on those first 2 albums. Here's my commission according to Sunset. The relationship's broken down because there's been a falling out of one degree or another. If you can't get the accounting, you can't know what you can invoice according to your contract. You've then got to maybe turn to courts, which you don't want to, hugely expensive, particularly if you're not owed a lot of money. And some of this, I mean, I've been listening to some big managers talk, but they say there can be an imbalance, that there are more artists that want management and fewer people that want to provide professional management services because they've been burnt. And there's quite a lot of managers now offering consultancy services or retainers where you're not getting 20% of the total, but you are getting a fixed monthly fee for fixed work, or you're purely providing strategy advice. And so you're saying, okay, I'll do a session with you. I will provide you my knowledge and advice. I'll help you build your own plan, but I'm not going to deliver it. You have to deliver it.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because then the manager becomes more like a freelance PR or a radio promotions team, where you say, I need you to work on this particular EP or this album, and I will pay you this much to do it, rather than, I'll have 20% of something if it's successful.
Indeed.
You actually get paid for your knowledge.
There are some managers who are paid like that huge amounts of money because the artist earns a lot of money, but you're not getting 20% of what the artist earns. The artist is already successful and they're saying, I'll pay you 100 grand a year if you're lucky, and you're going to work on my campaigns, but you are effectively salaried in a way. You're being paid fixed fee. There's sort of the converse of that. There are some who will be like £2,000 a month, then you work on individual projects and then you'll end it when you no longer need that work. Or, like I said, pure consultancy. There are quite a few people where you're not taking on the responsibility of delivery. You're purely providing that advice. So you're not really being a manager. You're right. I guess it's like a PR person not doing or writing the PR, but just going, this is how you would write the PR. Now you go off and write the PR yourself.
Right. How difficult is it structuring a management contract these days then, taking all this into account? Because surely you have to sort of know what the relationship is going to be right at the outset, because you've got to write all these things in, haven't you? So it's very clear as to how the manager is going to be paid, particularly with new artists. You've got to have that agreement right at the start that, okay, if we're not really earning anything, but you're doing a load of work, I tell you what, we'll pay. And you've got to drive. I was speaking to somebody the other day who said to be able to do this gig that his band were doing the other week, and they're a band sort of on the cusp, but he was saying to make this work, I had to drive. So essentially, I had to be the tour manager.
Yeah.
So, and I said, "Did you get paid as tour manager?" And in fact, they did. They came to an agreement.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Which is great. But those are some of the sort of things that you sort of almost need to, state at the outset. Do you
That's
think?
really
So there's
hard.
no confusion.
Yeah, it's really hard, and I think a lot of people don't know how. So people often start out with the trial period. We would encourage them always to put review points in as well, where you sit down and go, is this still working? Is it working for both of us? Is the structure of the agreement still working? I mean, there are a lot of managers and artists who never get around to having any form of agreement because of the legal costs involved. And again, if there's no money, spending a large amount of it on lawyers before, because also you might never make any money. I mean, I'm thinking back to my experience in the late 90s. I mean, the band split up. We were making a little bit and then they split up. I'm glad we didn't spend thousands of pounds of legal fees because it would have been more than we we ever earned by the time the singer and the guitarist had fallen out. So, sometimes people will come with sort of heads of terms. They'll do emails about where they think it should be. I guess sort of talking about, well, if I'm going to do additional stuff that we pay other people for, can we try and make provision for that? The tour management thing is one of the examples in the book, actually, in the guide that we put, to say, actually, if you're on the road and they're saving money from not paying an external tour manager, then what should be your rate for those services that you're providing? But you know how tough touring is, particularly grassroots touring at the moment. And when I speak to a member the other day, he said, well, you used to make money above, 1,000 to 2,000 capacity. There'd be some money. There'd certainly be some money in it for the artist, so potentially some money for the manager. Now, often not. Now you're having to get up to 3,000 cap to make enough money, just because the costs of touring have mounted. Can't increase the ticket fees that much. We're always talking about ticket fees and prices because people are looking at their own budgets at home and saying, how much can we afford on a new band for a ticket? And that means it's just taking even longer. And you get that weird thing where everyone else in the tours earn, but at the end of it, there's no money for the artist, there's no money for the manager. And, that's fair enough if you're both completely agreed. Sometimes it'd be like, well, the artist wanted to stay in a bit of a nicer hotel, which was their choice. They didn't want to, drive the crappy van. They wanted to have something nice. Fair enough. That's a choice. I mean, I speak to people who are like, well, the artist wanted a much nicer hotel and wanted a nicer seat on the aeroplane. And even though we're doing quite well, decided to spend all the additional money we would have made on comfort. That's their choice. But now I'm not earning anything, and I've spent 4 months working on a tour where there's now no profit and there should have been some. And that's a hard decision, because obviously agents commission on gross. So the agent's taking 10% on gross, so they're earning up front. The tour manager, the session musicians are all paid a day rate if there's enough money in it. So it's having the conversation about what's fair. Because in America, they commission differently. In America, the managers will have some form of commission on gross or net, whichever is more, and have some allowable costs, whereas in Britain, that's not been the case.
Do you think, as much as obviously this is, I think it's a great way of opening up the discussion around how managers get paid. I think that's really good, and the suggestions in the document are brilliant, because it makes you think about alternative ways of how managers get paid. But as much as we're doing that with the managers, isn't it also about trying to educate some of the artists? Because I don't know if artists really understand sometimes what a manager does, or they have an expectation of what a manager does that is far higher. I mean, it's just unobtainable almost. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I did. I had that discussion the other day with a member who shall remain nameless, working with a big artist who's doing some solo stuff. And they said the artist's expectations around the solo shows were for the same level of attention and comfort and team as they were for doing the really enormous shows. And this manager was just like, we can't do it. We can't do it. It's the expectation. And in fact, that's why we called our whole series Managing Expectations. And I think you're right, Steve. I actually think our members need to get a lot better as well at explaining to their artists what they're doing for them, because they do an awful lot of firefighting. I've been with members where they're like on the phone for hours arguing with the agent and the festival about what level, where they're billed on it. And in the end, they get onto something that's acceptable. And they're like, okay, now I can tell my client it's fine. But if I told my client at the start, the client would have spent hours. The whole thing would have been an utter nightmare. They might have refused to do the festival. Actually, we've managed to sort it and get it to a position where everyone's happy. But the artist has absolutely no idea that took 5 hours of my time. And if I tell them, then they'll probably be annoyed about the whole thing. And actually, if you, I don't know, if Vicky Dowdle and Nina Nesbitt have talked a lot about that, because Nina said that when she was an earlier stage artist signed to a major, and then even with independence, that Vicky would just go off and sort a load of stuff for her that she didn't know and didn't necessarily want to know, because she wanted to spend the time focusing on her music, and the trust was there that Vicky would problem solve and firefight and come to Nina and go, this is sorted, this is what we're doing. And now they co-own the label together. Nina's involved in all the discussions and is a bit like, oh God, this is really stressful. she's very open about it.
I mean, this is the thing. You just because if the artist doesn't appreciate how much work has gone into it and thinks it's happened by magic, then they're not going to have the appreciation of how much that is worth.
Yeah, I think that's the difficulty. Whereas everyone knows what a lawyer does and goes, oh yeah, a lawyer is someone you pay and they're very expensive. PR pluggers, maybe not as expensive as lawyers, but accountants, yes, fair enough. You pay the accountant for their time. You understand their service. I mean, we're talking about introducing a kind of a trial certification scheme for managers, which will be a kind of relatively light touch, but also robust test of knowledge to be able to say, actually, I am professional. This is the knowledge I bring to your career. And it's about the respect both ways. But you're right, it's hard, particularly people hide stuff and don't tell you all the work they've done. I did have one member who was trying to do it on, like a consultancy basis where she basically had one of those timers on her computer. And every time she'd start working on one of her clients, she'd like tick it. And then at the end of the week, she'd be like, right, I've spent 20 hours on this client and 20 hours on this client and 15 hours on that client. That was a full week, being able to kind of meter out exactly. But again, then maybe you're showing all the workings that the artist doesn't necessarily want to know.
Yeah, and so that's a difficult balance because also in some ways you don't want to burden the artist because it's the artist's job to create the thing which will hopefully at some point make you all money, and any worry or any fear or any insecurity that you instill in them is probably not going to get the best artistic work out of them, or maybe it will. Exactly. Maybe there's a whole concept album in the relationship between the artist and the manager and the bookkeeping. Who knows?
Oh God, no. There is, sure about that
one. there is a point as well here that these, as set out in your new guide, there are so many different scenarios at different stages of artist careers, because all artist careers are different, that, it isn't, as you say, there isn't a one size fits all, but also the realization that in a career now, you might have a relationship with a manager which changes. It's about finding the right way of payment for you at that point, you and your manager at that point.
Yeah, and as you say, it can really change. Who was I talking to the other day? I was talking to a member who said their client had gone off and written kind of musicals at one point, started off very much traditional and gone into all kinds of different spheres. And someone else who said, we're going to set up it was some kind of third-party bit. I know whenever I've talked to Tice Decorius, who manages John Legend, they've got loads of joint ventures together in lots of different products. And artists which are really entrepreneurial will continuously be bringing new ideas. And as you say, kind of being able to say, well, that's great, let's invest in together and develop a new tequila brand. I mean, that was one I'd heard of. But actually, I'm not doing that on a 20% commission. I'm going to do that as we're going to be partners in it if we're going to provide all the work together, or films. Sometimes they're making films together, doing all kinds of creative things. Because, some people do music and do it really well and don't want to do anything else, but some people are like creative in so many ways and can bring that creativity to lots of different products or productions. And so it's fine, it's just finding stuff that works, and that's why we've not gone, actually the new model is this, because I don't think you can possibly say that. We just want people to have kind of better conversations about what works for both parties, really.
And what do you think the reaction to the guide will be in general? How's it been so far? And I mean, because the music industry, it can be quite slow. I don't know if you noticed, it can be quite slow to adopt change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, there's nothing in there that isn't already happening. Someone in this guide is doing every single model that is outlined. But how quickly it will change, there will always be resistance, and there'll always be people who say, no, hang on a minute, this is the way it's always been done in the past, this is the way it should always be done in the future. One thing I would say is that it's not just us talking about this. I went to Australia last year for South by Sydney, and I met an academic called Guy Morrow, who was previously a manager. I think he managed Bears Den, actually, with Rowan Brand. But he's an academic now, and he's produced a book talking to loads of Australian managers and lawyers all about how the model needs to shift there and how the industry has changed. But there are still some people trying to work on a model that was possibly very effective 20, 30 years ago, but isn't now. So we're not the only ones having this conversation. But yeah, as you say, Steve, nothing is quick in the music industry. I don't think we're going to get together next year and go, oh, it's great, it's all sorted. Everyone's now got appropriate ways of remunerating everyone fairly that works for them. I think it'll take a lot longer than that.
I mean, talking of things that are sure to be sorted out in the next year, before we let you go, we wanted to ask you about the advocacy work you're doing, and I guess what the big concerns of your members are at the moment. Because I know you've mentioned the streaming economy. I know you've been talked about things like AI as well and been part of that debate. So what are the big things in your mind, in the minds of your members at the moment in terms of policy advocacy work?
Yeah, and in some ways they're different, the AI debate and the streaming debate. In some ways they're really similar. It's a new technology. Actually, going back to my 1992 example, here's a new technology. This is how the record labels have decided it's going to be implemented and how people are going to be paid for it, whether that was what was it called, digital compact cassette, or whether it was actually streaming is going to be paid on a pro rata basis, but we're going to apply your old pre-digital royalty rates model to pay that on. Or we're going to do a new AI, we're going to, license AI, but we're not going to tell you how you're going to be paid for it. So there is actually quite a lot of similarities there. And it's that point about artist consultation and consent and compensation. It tends to be, it's like we've all worked it out, this is how you're paid, not actually we need to have a dialogue about how this is going to work for artists, for labels, and for the wider industry. We're still in talks with government. We're told we met Chris Bryant, who's the new culture minister, through the Council of Music Makers, and he says he's committed to trying to see an industry-wide agreement. He's going to continue the work and isn't going to let it drop. So we think that's very positive. We are, you're right, Stuart, having discussions within UK music about artists' ability for consent on AI. So not just the label turns around and says, we've done a big deal with Suno or whoever to license a new generative AI thing, and we're going to give you this bit of money for it, hopefully, or no money because none of it's attributed. What we're hoping, what we would like to see is a really a proactive and explicit opt-in right for artists. So not an opt-out, not you can license my catalogue unless I tell you can't, but really proactive. Are you happy with us licensing your music into AI? If so, let's have a discussion about how you get paid for it.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because I guess a lot of the stuff coming out of the industry aimed at the AI world has been, you need to ask our permission, we need consent. But then I think it was the Council of Music Makers that came out with that thing saying, well, by the way, that goes two ways and labels and publishers need to ask our clients. And that was an interesting part of the debate because I feel like, I don't know, is there some of the kind of concerns lingering from the streaming debate? Do they play into that? Like people feeling like, well...
Absolutely. No, they really do. And actually AIM has been brilliant on the AI side, and they have agreed with the Council of Music Makers around the principle of kind of meaningful consent for music makers and obviously artists as music makers for ingestion of music into AI. That's not the position currently held. Publishers are saying it's too complicated, and the labels are basically saying, well, we negotiate individually with artists, and if their contracts already say for any form of new technology now and in the future we have the right to license, then we already have consent. We don't need to go and back and ask for it again. So yeah, all of those things play in together. I mean, God knows what will happen in America now. They were talking about something called the No Fakes Act that was for sort of voice and personality rights that we thought was reasonably good because it had to be explicit licensing around specific use cases and kind of time limited. So you couldn't just go, here's my image and personality, you can have it in perpetuity for any use you want to. It would be like, no, you can use my voice and my face for these music videos for this amount of time. So you couldn't just go, oh, you signed this contract 5 years ago, I've got everything I want, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. But I don't know what will happen under Trump, honestly. No idea if that will continue to go through. And then the other thing is the ticketing. I know you've also talked a lot about ticketing, but we spent years campaigning to try and get restrictions on ticket touting, because industrial scale ticket touting has been a real problem. And Adam Webb, who leads the Fanfare campaign with us, has been a fantastic campaigner and stuck it out. I must admit, I've been at the MMF 9 years and we set up Fanfare 8.5 years ago. And we were like, how long will this take? And we have a Labour Party commitment. We do have a Labour Party commitment, but they're still consulting on exactly how. And we'd like to see them follow the Irish model, because in Ireland, they just have a cap on ticket resale above 10%. And it seems to have taken out all the industry. We believe fans should be able to resell if they can't go. But it's the buy a load of tickets up front and speculatively resell them. We never have any intention of going to the show that we want to stop.
Yeah. I was just thinking on the subject of live, the live scene, how it interacts with management, was the old school merch bootleggers. I haven't seen merch bootleggers for a while. Have merch bootleggers disappeared, or are they still there?
It's online now, isn't it? There are those companies online where you can buy all the dodgy merch now, I think.
Right.
So you don't need to...
That's true. But I bet there were for those there must have been for the Taylor Swift shows. I bet they'll reappear somewhere on the streets for the Oasis. I bet they will. They'll have to be shut down again.
I bought some terrible T-shirts in my time outside gigs.
Did you?
Where
Have you still got any of them?
One wash and they disintegrate or go like crop top shape, which is not a good look.
Very trendy
for me,
now,
anyway.
You probably sell them on furloughed.
It's been lovely talking to you. If for anyone who's interested and wants to know more, particularly, I mean, I know we have managers who listen to this programme and some new and aspiring managers or people who'd like to get into music management. How do they find out more details and where can they find the guide?
Go onto our website, www.themmf.net, and you'll find the guide on there and how to sign up if you're not currently a member. And if you are a member, you'll get invited to all of our events. We did a great session at YouTube yesterday that actually was all about AI and productivity. So super interesting. But we've got stuff going on for members all the time. And this publication is just part of that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Annabella.
Thanks so much for having me.
Annabella Coldrick from the Music Managers Forum. What did you learn from that, Stuart? Did you pick up any handy tips when the Black Crows phone up and say, our manager's walked out on us? Stuart, you're a man in the industry. Will you be our manager?
Oh, I could ruin their career really well. Yeah, definitely. I'll take that. No, do you know, I've always thought music manager is a difficult job, and it's an often thankless job and hard work. And just hearing Annabella talk about all the different things that are kind of falling into their laps now, develop more artist development, driving the tour bus as an unpaid tour manager. It does feel like a lot, but it seems like quite an exciting time for managers too, in that you're doing more of that development work, for example, you're doing the stuff a label used to do. That could be quite wonderful if it works and your artist goes places and you're doing it with them. And some of those models you talk about, like the whole idea of joint ventures, collaborations, it feels like there's this new kind of way of doing it emerging. But like she said, I think it only matters if you're actually earning any money. And she was quite open, wasn't she, about how hard it is to make money, whether it's on the road, whether it's from recordings. So yeah, I politely decline still. I think if the Crows called me, I'd say that someone else is probably better suited for this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, as Annabella was hinting, there's lots of different avenues and opportunities, different ways of making money. But you've still got to manage to get those, take those opportunities. You've got to beat some other artist to the punch to get that work. So there's loads out there, or loads of different things out there. But to make some money, you've got to go and make those things happen, or they've got to fall into your lap. I tell you, one of the best things I think from that interview, though, is the idea that there are managers' WhatsApp groups. Can you imagine when a manager's WhatsApp group is like just swapping tales? Oh, you never guessed what my artist did last week.
It must be great. It's really it's interesting, that idea, and you mentioned that, I think, the idea of it can be a lonely profession being a manager, and I like the idea that there are WhatsApp groups and also this support. I mean, the other thing I thought was interesting was you mentioned that idea of artists being entrepreneurial, and I feel like we've talked about that, haven't we, a bit? Like, as an artist nowadays, you can do a lot of different things to try and get yourself a career that earns you money. And that idea of, I'm a creative artist, I can go and launch a tequila brand, or I can go and do this and that. That, again, to me, seems incredibly fun and interesting as a manager to be able to work on that kind of project. Although, if you're doing that while also handling everything else that comes in, I can imagine it's stressful as well. But I would do that. I would do that for if the Black Crows want a tequila brand or whiskey brand, probably is more suitable for them. I have a go at that. How hard can it be?
Yeah, it would be more of a task to sell photos of the Black Crow's feet. That's a running gag. That's what it's come down to now, managers. How can you monetize your artists' feet? Pictures of your artist's feet. Anyway, if you are an aspiring manager, well, even if you're not, we hope you found that informative. Thank you very much once again to Annabella from the MMF, and thank you for listening. If you are new to this podcast, please do subscribe to the show in your podcast app and give us a review and a rating. It all helps spread the word, which is what we need. Or you can support the show with, I don't know, with which I have to say, it runs on the thinnest of shoestrings. So any loose change, a couple of bob a month, you can throw it this way. Well, go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thepriceofmusic to find out how to become a fan of the show. And finally, of course, if you have a question of your own, something that's always bothered you about the music industry, how it works and how it's financed, a question which you'd like us to try and answer on the programme, email us your queries at thepriceofmusicpodcast@gmail.com. Till next time, look after yourselves. Keep music live. Ta-ra.